This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
On this week's programme, we talk to the Deputy Commissioner General at the Relief and Works Agency for Palestine that 75 years after it was formed is still struggling to bring relief to the occupants of Gaza.
The absolutely catastrophic situation in Gaza at the moment, with 90% of the population having been displaced multiple times. Only 11% of the Strip has not come under evacuation orders from Israel. You've got 2.2 million people basically in desperate need, and looming famine, total collapse of the solid waste management system, lack of water, destroyed infrastructure, 60% of the housing destroyed, and 43,000 people have been reportedly killed. Our mandate derives from a General Assembly resolution. UNRWA was created as a temporary measure, pending a lasting and just solution to the conflict that arose in 1948 and a solution for the Palestine refugees. We were not meant to last 75 years.
One of the speakers at last week's Economist conference held in Nicosia was Natalie Buckley, Deputy Commissioner General for Programmes and Partnerships at UNRWA. That's the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, which was established by the UN in 1949 to carry out relief and development programs for Palestinians who were displaced by the Nakba in the 1948 Palestine War. When I met with her, I asked Natalie what the main focus of her talk to the conference had been.
Right, so the event was focused, or my session was focused on the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. So what I spoke about was, I described the absolutely catastrophic situation in Gaza at the moment, with 90% of the population having been displaced multiple times. Only 11% of the Strip has not come under evacuation orders from Israel. You've got 2.2 million people basically in desperate need, in looming famine, total collapse of the solid waste management system, lack of water, destroyed infrastructure, 60% of the housing destroyed, and 43,000 people have been reportedly killed. The vast majority are women and children. And against that context, I then described what UNRWA, the agency I represent, the efforts that we are making, and also made some key sort of suggestions and asks for the situation to end.
How easy is it for you to do the work that you were originally set up to do, particularly after all those accusations after October last year that members of UNRWA were involved in the attacks by Hamas? Because there was immediate reaction. Everybody said, oh, look at that. But then it seems that actually when people have looked more deeply into it, very few staff members were involved.
If you don't mind, I'm going to break down that question into chunks. You said, how difficult is it for us to do the work that we were mandated to do? This is a very important point. Our mandate derives from a General Assembly resolution. UNRWA was created as a temporary measure, pending a lasting and just solution to the conflict that arose in 1948 and a solution for the Palestine refugees. We were not meant to last 75 years. But our mandate is enshrined in that resolution, which has been, has been renewed every 4 years or so, and now encapsulates what we do as government-like services. It's not only humanitarian assistance. Of course, that's what we do in Gaza because it's a dire humanitarian context. But before the war and in the other 5 fields, we are mandated to provide government-like services, education and health. So in Gaza, it's 660,000 kids who are not going to school today. UNRWA was providing education to 300,000 of these kids in our own schools. Altogether, we have 700 schools in the region. and health centers, 22 of them being in Gaza, 8 of which are still functioning. That's the first part of your question. The second part was, after the accusations, how difficult did it become? Of course, it became very difficult because many donors, actually 16 of our partners, froze or paused the funding to UNRWA pending investigation into these allegations, which concerned 12 plus 7, so I think it's 19 employees of UNRWA who were alleged to have been involved in the 7th of October attack.
It's funny, isn't it? In a court of law, you're innocent until proven guilty, but everybody seemed to jump to the conclusion that the accusations were absolutely true without even looking into them.
Well, I won't comment on what everybody seemed to say, but one thing for sure is, one, we do our utmost to uphold neutrality. But it's a very difficult context. We've got 33,000 employees who are Palestine refugees themselves. We cannot go after every single one of them and find out what they do in their spare time. This is impossible. The unfortunate reflection of what happened is because of these employees, or maybe 100 or maybe 200 who might be alleged to be part of Hamas, which is, by the way, a prohibited activity under our rules to be part of an armed group, it's tainted the whole agency. And this is not right. This is not right. These allegations, which we took very seriously, were immediately referred for investigation to the highest body in the UN. In respect of 9 of these people, there was no evidence or no sufficient evidence was provided by Israel to our investigators. In the case of other 9, so getting to 18, it was inconclusive. The report said that if the evidence could be authenticated and or corroborated, then maybe these employees might have been involved in the 7th of October attack. In other words, because Israel did not provide the evidence to be tested and challenged like in a court of law, as you said, then the investigation was inconclusive on that point, and the last employee was dead. So this is where we are now.
It does seem again to me that it seems in this context, one side can make all sorts of accusations and everybody just takes them at face value because it suits them. And I'm wondering your thoughts on that. I know that's a bit of a loaded question, and I know that perhaps you prefer not to answer it, but you've worked with these people. They are, as you said at the beginning, families of refugees that were made back in the 1940s. So we're talking a long, long history of resentment, perhaps. One wouldn't say it shouldn't be.
The fact is that all the partners and donors who suspended the funding then resumed it, but for one. Only one has not resumed, and this is the United States. The funding is still suspended at least until March, and I'm not sure that it will resume even next year. So it was resumed because we took action, and it was a shock, to tell you the truth, to everybody. I think these accusations came as a shock, and they came at a very high level. We took them very seriously. And the agency, as you might recall, fired. In the interest of the agency, it was 12 at the end who were fired because some were dead and others were not employees. But we fired whoever was an employee and who was the subject of these allegations because we took it very seriously and we know the damage that it would create to the agency. They were fired not because they were found guilty without having gone through a process. They were terminated in the interest of the agency. But thanks to those actions, and then the Colonna report as well, that looked at our processes and provided some reassurance to the partners that we've got extremely robust mechanisms in place, more than any other UN agency. We come under scrutiny far more than any other UN agency. Thanks to that, donor trust and funding resumed. But it's a constant struggle, yes.
And it's a constant struggle, even if you can transpose that funding into physical aid to get it into Gaza and the people who need it.
Right, and it's becoming more and more of a struggle. It's always been difficult. At the beginning of the war, nothing went in, if you remember, for about 6 weeks or 8 weeks, nothing went in. And then, Rafah was open, Kerem Shalom were open. But since the beginning, I think since July, a very little aid has been coming in. Since Rafah got closed, it's about 37 trucks on average that we're getting in over the past month. Israel will say that the UN is incompetent and cannot distribute. The reality is that the aid is stuck outside of Gaza. It's not only UNRWA's aid, it's the aid of all, other UN agencies. And there are very complicated procedures and processes to get the aid in. So it's stuck there. And once it's in, it's very difficult to distribute it and to deliver it to the people in need, because there is a complete breakdown of law and order in Gaza today. Israel, as the occupying power, would have the responsibility to ensure that the aid is going to the population it occupies. There is no local police in force there that can do that.
So the bottom line is, I'm thinking Cyprus is also sending aid fairly regularly, which, as far as I know, after they stopped using that silly jetty that they took away, it goes to Ashdod. And my understanding is that then, although it's been checked by the authorities in Cyprus, under the supervision, I might add, of Israelis in Cyprus, it goes across the sea and it needs to be checked again by the Israelis. Is this all a way of just making sure it takes an awful long time before it gets released? Because if it's been checked in Cyprus with Israeli supervision, why do they need to check it again?
I'm not sure about that, but this is basically depicts the long processes, because it's not only for the aid coming from Cyprus, on which I have no direct knowledge of, I'll be honest. But any aid, even at the beginning of the war, you would have to offload the trucks before coming into Gaza. It gets checked, and then there is this dual item list, which is extremely strict. And so you might have seen that even toys like wooden toys or children's scissors are not allowed in. At some stage, it was crutches that were not allowed in. Anything with metal in it or anything with wood in it, even medical equipment, would not be allowed in. So all this takes an awful amount of time to be checked. A lot of aid gets sent back. And then once into Gaza, it's got to be reloaded again, offloaded. So there's all this mechanism of offloading once and then again into Gaza, reloading and put into different trucks. All this takes a lot of time. But the problem with Ashdod for us is that because of the Knesset laws that were recently passed, if they are implemented, it will put even more obstacles on our way in terms of enabling us to do our work, and it may actually even cripple or end our operations in Gaza. If I may add, the reality is that when an enabling environment is created and when there are sufficiently long pauses, as we saw for the vaccination campaign, the polio vaccination campaign, first phase and second phase, the UN is very efficient and managed to do its work.
The occupying force is Israel, and my understanding of international law is that they have obligations to the population they are occupying.
That is correct.
But they're not doing that.
Well, the population is in desperate need. They don't have enough to eat. There is insufficient water. There is sewage absolutely everywhere. No, there will be at some stage a commission of inquiry. There will be, and we're calling for accountability at the end of all this. We hope that there will be apportionment of the accountability. But yes, today the population does not have what it takes to remain alive. I mean, it's 60%, destruction. I don't know how many thousands of people are probably under the rubble as well. They're starving, especially in the north. There's a looming famine. There's a recent IPC report that again warns of famine in the north.
It seems that when those reports come out, a few more trucks are allowed in just to sort of soften it a little bit, and then it's back to how it was. Now, I recall talking to somebody, I think end of last year, beginning of this year, that something like 500 aid trucks were required daily in order to support the refugee population in Gaza. And as time went on, it went down to maybe 100 and then 50. How many trucks are getting in now?
So before the war, indeed, there were about 500 trucks that were coming into Gaza with various goods, non-food items, whatever it takes. But more importantly, Rosie, there was I'm not going to say thriving, but perhaps compared to what there is now, which is non-existent, there was a thriving commercial sector. There was the private sector. There were commerce. People had a life, a difficult life, but people had a life. Today, there is no commercial sector whatsoever. So it's a compounded crisis. So not only aren't there any trucks coming in or like a trickle of trucks, as I said, there was about 37 over the past month that come in daily, which is, a drop in the ocean in terms of the needs there as the war has progressed over the past 14 months. But there is also no functioning commercial sector. And so you've got a population which is literally trapped under siege and is not getting sufficient aid to survive. There's 20,000 orphans as well there in Gaza with no families. What is going to happen to these people? They're not going to school. They're not being fed. How will this population, the Israelis and the Palestinians, eventually live in peace if this is not resolved through a political solution? I really wonder.
Well, despite all the hardships and the, let's say, lack of a positive outlook, I think we also have to talk about the fact that the current Israeli government seems intent on preventing UNRWA from continuing its work. There have been bills passed in the Knesset recently. Now, what happens if those are, ratified? When they pass a bill, does that mean it happens? It didn't happen so far with the fraud allegations against Netanyahu. Does it mean that it will happen regardless? And if so, where does that leave UNRWA?
So indeed, on the 28th of October, 2 bills were passed in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, against UNRWA, basically aiming to prohibit any activities and representation of UNRWA in the sovereign territory of Israel, which is...
Sorry, stop there. There is no sovereign territory of Israel because it never defined its borders. And it is an occupier both in the West Bank and in Gaza. So that is not Israel, that is Palestine.
I'm quoting the bills.
Okay.
I'm merely quoting the bills. In the sovereign territory of Israel. And one of the of course, issues with these bills is what does that mean? Because Israel is the occupying power in East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza. So that the bills would prevent UNRWA's activities, representation, work in, again, I quote, the territory of Israel. And the bills also, basically, what it says, again, I quote, is it expires the agreement that UNRWA has with Israel to be able to do its work with the required privileges and immunities that attach to a UN agency. They're very dangerous, these bills, because if they are implemented, so you're right, they are passed, it doesn't mean that they will be implemented, even though that this seems to be the clear intention of the government of Israel, but not, there have been in the past bills that were passed but were not implemented. So our call is for all those who may be able to assist to exert pressure on Israel so that these bills are not implemented.
Surely they're just simply illegal if they're calling it sovereign territory. That was my original reason for mentioning it.
Yeah, so there are enormous problems with the bill from an international law perspective, this being one of them. The other one being that regardless of the expiry of the agreement between UNRWA and Israel, Israel has ratified and is a signatory, therefore, to the UN General Convention on Privileges and Immunities, which is a higher norm. So this law seems to contradict a higher treaty to which Israel is a party without reservation. And more importantly, perhaps here, from an international law perspective as well, the bills, it's an attempt by Israel, so a member state, to unilaterally alter the mandate of UNRWA, a mandate which was given by the General Assembly. So there are many problems on the international law sphere with regards to these bills, and you may be aware of an initiative by the government of Norway to refer the matter on these points to the International Court of Justice for an opinion.
And dare I say, we know that Israel takes absolutely no notice of the International Court of Justice.
Well, there are other initiatives as well, because these bills create a dispute, basically, in international law as to the application of privileges and immunities to an agency. And there might be other avenues to take this matter, but not for an advisory opinion, but for a ruling to the International Court of Justice on this dispute. So let's see what happens. I think if enough pressure is exerted, unfortunately, I think Israel is also isolating itself, in this venture, and it's not, I wouldn't say it's good for its future either.
How difficult is it for the remaining staff you still have in Gaza? I'd be interested to know how many of those there are still and what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, because with so little aid coming in, particularly if they don't have the security to unload those trucks, what do they actually do on a day-to-day basis? The medicines we've heard about are needed, water is needed, let alone food. So can you talk me through a day in the life of the UNRWA staff at the moment?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. The numbers are astounding. We have close to 13,000 staff. 13,000 staff in Gaza. Some have left, but it's maybe a couple of hundreds. Every day, between 5,000 and 6,000 staff members work still every day, and they rotate that way. Our premises, 200 of which have been hit, have been turned into shelters. So our schools, our offices, our warehouses, they've turned into shelters. At some stage, the agency I represent, was sheltering 1.7 million people. 1.7 million people. Gaza is 2.2 million people. We still shelter today 1 million people in our shelters. A shelter is not only a roof over your head. It's providing whatever food we have, whatever medicine we have. And you ask me, but what do they do if there aren't enough, food and medicine? There's a lot more that goes on in these shelters. First of all, 1,000 of the staff are medical staff. We still have 8 health centers that are functioning, and we've established 90 mobile medical clinics, sort of medical teams that roam around, go to the shelters and provide every day 16,000 consultations. This is primary healthcare, but it's turned into, whatever they can do, right, for people who are sick. That's on the health front. There's also the psychosocial support that is provided.
That must be near impossible in the current situation.
But it's very important in all the shelters that we have. We have social workers. We've got, teachers can't teach, right? Even though we've got a back to learning campaign since the 1st of August. So again, this is also happening in and around the shelters of keeping children occupied and just to think about something else. We have beautiful videos on our website that I really encourage you to look at. They're very, they bring a smile to your face, but they make you also very sad because you wonder what the future of these children will be. We do, our teachers teach basic maths, basic literacy, but they do drawings and singing and whatever keeps these children occupied. So this is psychosocial support. And so the health, psychology, the education, this is what happens every day. Our staff have been displaced themselves. 249 of them have been killed. But they get up every day and they work. They come to work. They do what they can. They can't do their own professions, perhaps, but then they'll manage the shelters, because a shelter is not only, as I said, a roof over your head, but you've got to manage the shelters as well.
Do you have a message of hope for the future? Because I find it so difficult, having followed this for well over a year now, to see what the outcome can possibly be, because my take on it is that the way this has been conducted is surely a surefire way of ensuring that a whole new generation of resistance fighters will grow up in Palestine and a few years down the line, I hope not, but might we see the same thing again, because the hatred surely is now ingrained?
Yeah, and this is my fear as well. You don't fight an ideology with weapons, and you don't resolve a situation of that type through military means. There is a need for a political solution, because it actually pains me to think that, I think as I said at the beginning of this podcast, neither Israelis nor Palestinians will be able to live in peace in the future for the reasons that you mentioned. Because what do you do with an entire generation who has no hope? So a political solution is needed. It's not too late. It's never too late, but the political will is needed for that. And as part of that, one needs a ceasefire, and one needs to have all the hostages released unconditionally. And so the parties to the conflict are both responsible for that.
We ought to end it there, but I just want to ask you quickly about the situation in the West Bank, because that's been very much off the front page while eyes have been on Gaza, and yet on a daily basis Palestinians are being killed, arrested, targeted, and we've heard dreadful stories about torture in Israeli jails, and I think there's over 1,000 Palestinians being held, many without trial. So do you work in the West Bank as well?
We work in the West Bank as well. As you said, I think if all eyes were not on Gaza or Lebanon, it would be on the West Bank, because this is like a perfect storm again brewing. We've got 50,000 students in our schools in the West Bank. We also operate health centres. It's exactly the same, and we provide social assistance to 500,000 Palestine refugees in the West Bank. So we're very, very active. There has been an uptick, an increase in military incursions in the camps, and every time the infrastructure is destroyed, we've seen an increase in settlers' violence and an increase in the settlements. And the current government, as we know, the coalition of right-wing surrounding Prime Minister Netanyahu is very much in favour of increasing these settlements. It's another storm brewing, and this is why the war in Gaza actually is not only about Gaza anymore. It's about the region, and it's about also, it may have very adverse consequences. We already see it. It's spreading in the region, but also worldwide, because unless there is this political will to actually respect international law, and the pronouncements of the International Court of Justice, which is very clear through its advisory opinion of the 19th of July, which has given rise to a General Assembly resolution, which was passed on the 13th of September, requesting member states to abide by the pronouncements of the ICJ. The same thing with the provisional measures that were indicated for Israel. None of this was respected unless there is this will, which existed after the Second World War. It's not looking very rosy for the future.
Nathalie Buckley, Deputy Commissioner General for Programmes and Partnerships at UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. And finally, in other news this week, you may recall that back in July, we talked about the fact that the deputy mayors elected as part of the reform of local government didn't actually have any duties assigned to them. Well, coming up to 6 months on, finally, the Minister of the Interior, Konstantinos Ioannou, has admitted that indeed this is the case, even though they're receiving payment, funded, of course, by the taxpayer. The minister conceded that the law governing the new system doesn't spell out the duties of the 93 deputy mayors that were elected across the island. In other words, they have no actual duties, but of course they are receiving pretty generous salaries. A deputy mayor's pay depends on the population of any given borough. In large boroughs, their salary is pegged at 50% of what the local mayor makes, and the mayors themselves earn about as much as members of parliament. So the mayors in the largest metropolitan areas, that's Nicosia, Limassol, Paphos and Paralimni, get about €6,500 per month. By comparison, the highest salary for deputy mayors is some €3,200. That means that total annual payouts on salaries for mayors, deputy mayors and councillors works out at some €6.5 million. Clearly something needs to be done because taxpayers' money is being wasted, and the fact that deputy mayors had no official duties was known to everybody. We even discussed it on the programme back at the beginning of the summer, when the House was voting through the laws on the new system of local government. Well, in Parliament earlier this week, UNRWA said that the government feels that the number of deputy mayors is too great and that steps should be taken to reduce it drastically. However, he didn't really address the fact that even if the number is reduced, we ought to know what exactly, if anything, those deputy mayors will be doing to earn their salaries. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.